Richard Carter slowly set a thick folder on my desk and looked around the office I'd spent 6 years building from nothing. "You have 96 hours," he said. I frowned. 96 hours for what? To hand this place back to us. For a moment, I honestly thought I'd misheard him. He folded his hands behind his back and glanced through the floor-to-ceiling windows, overlooking hundreds of acres of green fields, glass greenhouses, and workers loading fresh produce onto company trucks. "Vanessa is moving back from Chicago," he continued. "Your sister will be taking over the farm." I stared at him. "This farm?" He nodded, as if it were the most reasonable decision in the world. "She deserves a life like this." I couldn't even find words. Every fence outside, every barn, every irrigation system, every greenhouse, every acre of healthy soil. Every one of them existed because I had refused to give up when everyone else already had. "You can't be serious. I've already made my decision." "It's not your decision." His jaw tightened. "Don't embarrass yourself, Blessing. Family comes before paperwork." He tapped the folder once. "Our attorney will handle the transfer." Then he turned toward the door. "Oh, Vanessa's already packing." The office became painfully quiet after he left. I walked to the window. Harvest crews were finishing the day's work, while forklifts moved pallets toward refrigerated trailers bearing the Carter Farms logo. 6 years. 6 years of 18-hour days. 6 years of fixing broken tractors with borrowed tools. 6 years of negotiating with banks that laughed at my business plans. And now my own father believed he could simply walk in and hand everything to my sister. How? That question refused to leave my mind. How could he possibly believe he had that kind of authority? The answer started years earlier. When my mother passed away, everyone expected my older sister, Vanessa, to receive almost everything. She had always been the favorite. She loved expensive restaurants, designer clothes, and the excitement of downtown Chicago. Nobody was surprised when Mom left her an elegant luxury condo overlooking the Chicago River. Then the attorney announced my inheritance. An abandoned farm nearly 40 miles outside town. The roof leaked. The barns leaned sideways. The machinery barely started. The property owed years of unpaid taxes. Most of the soil had been neglected for so long that neighboring farmers quietly called it dead land. Dad actually laughed. "I suppose somebody has to take the junk." Vanessa smiled across the conference table. "Congratulations," she said with a grin. "Mom left you a retirement home for raccoons." Everyone laughed. Everyone except my mother's attorney. He simply watched me. When the meeting ended, Dad offered to help me sell the place immediately. "You'll never make money out there." I thanked him and drove to the farm instead. The first night, I slept inside the old farmhouse, wearing my winter coat, because there was no working heat. Rain dripped into buckets beside my bed. The electricity failed twice before sunrise. I remember standing on the porch the next morning, looking across fields everyone else considered worthless. I didn't see ruined land. I saw one opportunity nobody else wanted badly enough. The years that followed demanded everything I had. I delayed graduate school. I emptied every savings account. I repaired equipment myself. I planted crops that barely covered expenses. I reinvested every dollar instead of paying myself. Little by little, things changed. Then faster. Greenhouses replaced empty fields. Organic contracts replaced debt notices. Processing facilities replaced abandoned sheds. Investors came. National grocery chains signed contracts. Agricultural magazines featured our success. The place everyone mocked became one of the fastest-growing specialty farms in the region. Ironically, Dad had never visited until this week. The tour lasted less than 2 hours. Apparently, that was all it took for him to decide the farm suddenly belonged to the family again. I was still standing beside the office window when I noticed dust rising from the long gravel driveway. One SUV appeared, then another, then a third. Luxury vehicles. Black. New. Moving slowly toward the farmhouse. As the first SUV stopped, the driver's door opened. Vanessa stepped out wearing oversized sunglasses and designer boots. She smiled before she even looked around, as if she already owned everything she could see. Vanessa took off her sunglasses before she even reached the porch. She stopped halfway up the stone walkway. The confident smile she'd worn all the way from Chicago slowly disappeared. "This," she whispered, turning in a slow circle, "this can't be the same place." It wasn't. The collapsing barn she remembered had become a modern processing facility with polished steel siding. The empty pasture beyond it now stretched into neat rows of thriving vineyards. Glass greenhouses shimmered in the afternoon sun. Electric utility carts moved quietly between buildings, while employees in company uniforms loaded fresh produce into refrigerated trucks. A large wooden sign near the entrance read, "Carter Heritage, FARMS. Estimated shipment departure, 4:00 p.m. Vanessa stared at it. "I thought Mom left you a dump." "She did." Her eyes narrowed. "Then, where did all this come from?" I simply looked across the fields. 6 years. Dad stepped beside her. "It doesn't matter." Vanessa looked confused. "What do you mean?" "It doesn't matter who built it." He spoke with absolute certainty. "The property belongs to this family." I folded my arms. "It belongs to me." "No." He shook his head. "It belonged to your mother. Now it belongs where it benefits the family most." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "When the bank threatened foreclosure during my first year, where were you?" Neither of them answered. "When the roof collapsed during winter?" Silence. "When I couldn't afford diesel fuel and worked these fields by hand?" Dad sighed impatiently. "That was your choice." "My choice." "You insisted on keeping a worthless farm." I laughed once. Not because it was funny. Because I finally understood. None of those years mattered to him. Only today's value did. Vanessa walked toward one of the guest cottages overlooking the lake. "I'll probably use this as my office," she said casually. Then she pointed toward the farmhouse. "That bedroom upstairs gets the best sunrise. I'll take that one." She wasn't asking. She was planning. She wandered through the courtyard, discussing where she'd entertain clients. "I think this greenhouse should become an event venue. And we can renovate that barn into a wedding hall." Dad smiled proudly. "I knew you'd have vision." I looked from one to the other. Neither of them had asked whether I agreed. Neither had asked whether I intended to stay. In their minds, I had already been erased. Dad checked his watch. "I've already contacted an attorney." My stomach tightened. "He'll prepare the transfer documents." "You don't have documents to transfer." "We'll see." He started walking toward his truck. "Don't force this to become unpleasant." Vanessa climbed back into her SUV with a satisfied smile. "I'll start bringing furniture down next week." The convoy disappeared down the gravel driveway, leaving a cloud of dust hanging over the entrance. For several minutes, I didn't move. The only sounds were distant tractors and birds settling into the orchards. Then my phone vibrated. An unfamiliar number. I almost ignored it. Instead, I answered. "Hello." There was a brief pause. Then an older man's calm voice spoke. "Blessing, this is Samuel Whitmore." I immediately recognized the name. My mother's estate attorney. "I've been waiting 6 years for this phone call," he said quietly. My heartbeat quickened. "What do you mean?" Another silence. Then he spoke words that made me grip the phone tighter. There's something your mother instructed me never to tell you. Unless your father tried to take the farm. I've been waiting 6 years for this phone call, Samuel Whitmore repeated. I walked away from the farmhouse until I reached the edge of the vineyard. What aren't you telling me? I'm telling you exactly what your mother instructed me to tell you. His voice remained calm. Nothing more. I leaned against one of the wooden fence posts. My father says he's already hired an attorney. I know. You know. He contacted my office yesterday. That stopped me cold. He wanted copies of your mother's estate records. And I declined. My pulse quickened. Why? Because he requested only the pages he believed supported his position. I frowned. There are other documents. There are. Before I could ask another question, Samuel interrupted. Don't confront your father yet. What? Let him continue. I don't understand. You will. His tone became deliberate. Your mother expected this to happen. The line went quiet for a moment. Tomorrow morning, your father intends to make a public announcement. My stomach tightened. How do you know that? Because he invited me. I closed my eyes. So this isn't just about us anymore. No. It becomes public tomorrow. Before hanging up, Samuel added one final sentence. Bring every business record you've kept over the past 6 years. Then the call ended. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. By 8 o'clock, unfamiliar vehicles were already filling the parking area beside the farm store. Neighbors. Extended relatives. Local business owners. County officials. Even reporters from the regional agricultural newspaper. I watched from my office window as Dad greeted everyone with confident handshakes. Vanessa stepped out wearing a cream-colored designer suit that looked better suited for a corporate boardroom than a working farm. She smiled for photographs, as though she'd already inherited everything. One of my cousins hurried over. Blessing, she whispered, what's going on? I wish I knew. She looked uncomfortable. Your dad says today's a celebration. Outside, folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows, facing the restored red barn. Someone had even ordered catered food. Large banners hung across the entrance. Welcome home, Vanessa. I stared at the words. Not one banner mentioned the employees who had helped build this business. Not one acknowledged 6 years of work. To everyone arriving, I had already disappeared. Richard stepped onto a small wooden platform and tapped the microphone. The conversations faded. Thank you all for coming. He smiled proudly. As many of you know, our family has owned this land for generations. Several people nodded. My daughter, Blessing, has done admirable work maintaining the property. Maintaining. I almost laughed. Then he continued. But every family reaches a point where leadership must pass to the right person. He extended his hand toward Vanessa. My eldest daughter will now guide Carter Heritage Farms into its next chapter. Applause spread through part of the crowd. Vanessa accepted hugs. Someone handed her flowers. Another guest asked when she planned to move into the farmhouse. She answered without hesitation. This weekend. I stood less than 20 feet away. Invisible. A local farmer shook his head at me. You should have just agreed, he muttered. Family should stay together. Another relative sighed. Don't be greedy, Blessing. Greedy. The word stung more than I expected. Then I noticed 2 familiar faces arriving together. Samuel Whitmore. And beside him, David Ellis, president of the agricultural bank that had financed my expansion 3 years earlier. David spotted me first. He smiled politely before shaking my hand. Good to see you again, Ms. Carter. Several guests immediately turned. Most of them had never heard anyone address me so formally. Richard noticed. His smile flickered. Samuel said nothing. He simply observed every conversation unfolding around him. Every accusation. Every congratulation directed toward Vanessa. Every assumption that I had already lost. Only after nearly everyone had spoken did Samuel quietly walk over to me. He lowered his voice. Your mother left much more than a will. My heart pounded. Then why don't you stop this now? Because everyone here needs to reveal exactly who they are first. Before I could answer, Vanessa laughed loudly across the courtyard. She was showing contractors where she wanted a luxury guest spa built. Photographers captured images of her standing in front of the farmhouse. Within minutes, relatives were congratulating her online. My phone buzzed repeatedly with notifications. Every post described her as the new owner. I said nothing. The silence convinced almost everyone that the transfer was inevitable. Richard lifted a leather folder. Our attorney has prepared. One moment. Samuel Whitmore's calm voice carried across the entire courtyard. Every head turned. He walked slowly toward the platform. Without raising his voice, he asked one simple question. Before we continue, he looked directly at Richard. Has anyone here actually read the complete estate file? The applause stopped instantly. Richard's expression hardened. Samuel reached into his briefcase. Then, in full view of everyone present, he carefully placed a sealed envelope bearing my mother's unmistakable handwriting onto the table. The sealed envelope sat in the middle of the table. No one spoke. Even the breeze that had been rustling the corn seemed to disappear. Samuel Whitmore rested one hand on the envelope, but didn't open it. Before I read what's inside, he said, I need one thing placed on the record. Richard crossed his arms. This isn't necessary. I'm afraid it is. Samuel looked toward a man standing near the back of the crowd. Mr. Lawson. A gray-haired county registrar stepped forward carrying a hard-sided document case. Several people whispered. Richard's expression tightened. What is the county registrar doing here? Samuel answered without looking at him. Confirming facts. The registrar unlocked the case and carefully removed certified copies of property records. He laid them across the table one by one. This, he said, pointing to the first document, is the deed recorded after probate. Everyone leaned closer. It lists one owner. He paused. Blessing Carter. Samuel nodded. The next document. The registrar placed down another certified record. Building permits. Another. Irrigation permits. Another. Commercial processing licenses. Another. Environmental compliance certifications. Another. Solar infrastructure approvals. Each document carried the same name. Blessing Carter. Richard shifted uncomfortably. Those improvements were made on inherited family land. The registrar looked directly at him. No. Richard frowned. What do you mean, no? The property stopped being part of the family estate the day probate closed. A ripple moved through the crowd. Richard immediately objected. That's impossible. It isn't. The registrar calmly tapped the deed. Once ownership transferred, every legal improvement became the responsibility and the property of the titled owner. He slid another document forward. Every tax payment. Another. Every loan agreement. Another. Every insurance policy. Another. Every agricultural grant. All signed by me. No family partnership. No shared ownership. No trust. No joint control. Only my signature. Vanessa's confidence began slipping. She quietly stepped away from the photographers. Richard forced a smile. Fine. He pointed toward Samuel. She's still standing on inherited property. Samuel finally spoke. That brings us to the next document. He removed a second folder from his briefcase. This agreement was executed by Margaret Carter 6 months before her passing. He handed certified copies to the registrar. The older man adjusted his glasses and began reading aloud. The beneficiary shall retain exclusive ownership of all present and future agricultural businesses developed upon the property. He looked up. The language continues. Samuel gestured for him to proceed. No improvements, commercial assets, infrastructure, business revenue, conservation developments, or future appreciation shall become part of the remaining family estate under any future circumstance. Several people exchanged confused looks. Richard's face lost color. Samuel continued. Your wife understood that this farm would likely be worthless when she passed. He glanced toward me. But she also believed Blessing could change that. Vanessa slowly lowered the bouquet she'd been holding. That's impossible. Samuel shook his head. No. It's documented. He reached for another page. Margaret required every expansion to be legally separated from the inherited land itself. David Ellis, the bank president, finally stepped forward. Our bank insisted on verifying ownership before approving every loan. He looked directly at Richard. We wouldn't have financed millions of dollars in improvements if anyone else had ownership rights. Several guests gasped quietly. Richard looked around desperately. There has to be another interpretation. There isn't. David spoke with absolute certainty. The company belongs entirely to Blessing. The words landed heavily across the courtyard. Vanessa slowly pulled out her phone. Within seconds, she began deleting the celebration photos she'd posted less than an hour earlier. Several relatives noticed. Others quietly stepped away from Richard. The same people who had congratulated Vanessa minutes earlier suddenly found themselves avoiding eye contact. Richard's attorney finally cleared his throat. He flipped rapidly through the certified documents, then stopped. His shoulders sank. He quietly closed the folder. Richard stared at him. Well, the attorney hesitated, then answered honestly. I recommend we go no further. Richard's jaw tightened. No. There must be something else. Samuel looked down at the sealed envelope. There is. Every person present instinctively leaned forward. He carefully broke the wax seal. Inside rested a single folded letter written in my mother's familiar handwriting. Samuel unfolded it slowly. He looked at Richard, then at Vanessa. Finally, he began reading my mother's final instructions aloud. Samuel unfolded the letter with both hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but my mother's handwriting was unmistakable. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he began reading. To my family. His voice was steady. If this letter is being read, then the day I feared has finally arrived. Richard's confident posture disappeared. Vanessa stared silently at the table. Samuel continued. Richard, I know you better than anyone. If Blessing turns that neglected farm into something valuable, you will eventually convince yourself it should belong to the family again. Several people looked toward my father. Nobody spoke. And Vanessa. She slowly looked up. You have always loved finished success more than difficult beginnings. Vanessa's face flushed. She opened her mouth to object, but couldn't. The words were painfully accurate. Samuel continued reading. The Chicago condominium was never meant to be compared with the farm. He paused before continuing. I left each daughter exactly what matched her character. The silence became heavier. Vanessa wanted immediate comfort. Blessing always preferred opportunity. My throat tightened. I hadn't heard my mother's voice in 6 years. Yet somehow, every sentence sounded exactly like her. Samuel looked down at the final pages. The farm was never my greatest gift. Everyone listened. The opportunity was. He lifted another document from the envelope. This is the legal agreement referenced in Mrs. Carter's letter. He handed certified copies to Richard's attorney. The attorney read for less than 30 seconds before slowly removing his glasses. He looked directly at Richard. There is no legal path. Richard stared at him. What do you mean? The deed is absolute. He turned another page. The conservation covenant prohibits any forced transfer. Another page. The operating company exists as an entirely separate legal entity. Another. The land improvements belong exclusively to Blessing. He quietly closed the folder. Your wife anticipated this exact situation. Richard looked as though someone had knocked the air from his lungs. No. Samuel nodded once. She didn't simply leave Blessing a farm. He rested his hand on the documents. She spent years making certain no one could ever take away what Blessing built. Richard slowly lowered himself into a nearby chair. For the first time in my life, I saw my father completely speechless. Vanessa finally found her voice. So, she swallowed. None of this is mine. Samuel answered gently. It never was. She looked across the fields. The vineyards. The orchards. The processing facility. The greenhouses. Everything she'd already imagined owning. It had never belonged to her. Without another word, she quietly deleted the remaining photographs from her phone. One by one, the contractors she had invited quietly packed their equipment. The photographer lowered his camera. Guests who had congratulated her only minutes earlier slowly walked away without saying goodbye. Richard stood again. He looked at me for a long time. The words refused to come. He had always believed authority could replace accountability. Today it couldn't. Several relatives approached me instead. I'm sorry, my aunt said quietly. I should have asked what really happened. Another cousin nodded. We believed the wrong people. Even neighbors, who barely knew me, shook my hand. We watched you rebuild this place, one elderly farmer said. You earned every acre. David Ellis smiled. I've financed a lot of businesses. He looked around the farm. Very few people build something like this from nothing. I thanked him. Then I turned toward Samuel. I don't know how to repay you. He smiled warmly. You already did. I looked confused. You honored your mother's faith in you. Within days, Richard's attorney formally withdrew every claim. The attempted takeover spread quickly throughout the local farming community. Not because anyone enjoyed gossip, but because everyone had witnessed the confrontation themselves. Business partners reached out with congratulations. Several suppliers extended long-term contracts. A regional agricultural association invited me to speak about rebuilding neglected farmland. Instead of slowing down, the business grew even faster. Months later, I purchased the neighboring property with company profits. Not because I wanted to prove anything to my family, because it was simply the right business decision. Vanessa returned to Chicago. The condo she had once celebrated no longer seemed nearly as impressive. Richard called several times during the following months. Sometimes he left voicemails. Sometimes he didn't. I listened to every message. I returned none. Not out of anger, but because some conversations arrive years too late. One autumn morning, I hung my mother's handwritten letter inside a simple wooden frame on the office wall. Every employee who entered could see it. Not because it was a legal document, because it reminded me of something far more valuable. Real wealth isn't what someone leaves you. It's what you're trusted to build. Every morning before walking outside, I still pause in front of that framed letter. Then I look through the same office window where my father once demanded I surrender everything. Now I see something completely different. Not revenge. Not victory. Just fields filled with possibilities that no one can ever take away. The farm my family tried to reclaim became the place where I finally realized my mother's greatest inheritance was never the land. It was her belief that I could transform it into a future no one else had the vision or the courage to build.